Hi there, this is the second video in the series looking at Joomla 4 concepts, and in this video we're going to be looking at the first of these new classes which are introduced in Joomla 4, which is the extension class. So if you look at Joomla 3, in Joomla 3 the Joomla core and various Joomla extensions would be calling into our com hello world code to perform various functions. So for example, the router within Joomla would be calling our site router.php file build and parse functions if we had a custom router. The Joomla core, when it wanted to run our component, would be looking at our hello world PHP file and doing a require on that, whether it was in the admin or the site area. Com associations. Now, com associations is the functionality which is associated with multilingual associations, and it would be coming into our component and accessing helpers associations.php, for example, to find the item types, and the item types related to the types of hello world records that would have associations. And in our case in hello world we had two types of records. We had greetings, which is the hello world records themselves, plus hello world categories, and we could set up associations on both of those. So com associations comes in and asks what are the item types that you have associations with, and then follows that up with finding out configuration data for those item types. Com fields was introduced whenever we used custom fields on our hello world component, and com fields stores its data in a fields database table, and it needs to look into that table to find the key which would be associated with hello world. So it would look at our helpers hello world.php file and look for this validate section function, which would tell it which key to use whenever it was looking at its database table, and we would return something like hello world. Com tags, then when it was outputting a list of items which were associated with tags T1, T2 there, it would come into our hello helpers root.php file and be calling get hello world root or get category root, which would enable it to output these items as links so that you could actually click on those to actually get to them. So as I said, under Joomla 3 there were a number of cases where the Joomla code was coming into our code in a bit of a haphazard way, looking for information and calling specific functions and expecting us to provide those. Now in Joomla 4 that is changed to be a lot more consistent really. So the Joomla functions would then in Joomla 4 call this common function boot component, which is part of the library code within Joomla, and the boot component would then instantiate our extension class. So it would look in our extension directory here, and it would look for our hello world component and it would instantiate that, and it would return that instance back to the calling function, and then it would be the responsibility of the calling function to call various functions in our extension to enable the calling function to get the information that it required. So our extension class is in admin source extension hello world component.php, and that's what I've just opened there. And it provides a focal point for Joomla core or other components which want to interact with our component. And if we look at Joomla 3 here, there's certain functions that the core Joomla classes want to call to find out certain bits of information. And we need to provide those functions within our extension class. So sometimes that function is coded directly in our extension class. For example, com fields. If we look at here, it's looking for a validate section. And if we look at our Hello World component here and we scroll down, we find that function validate section. And we also find another one, get context, which is used by com fields. And if you go back to this step here, adding custom fields, you'll find out more about why we need to add those things into our code. But basically, with those com fields functions, we code those directly into the Hello World component into our extension class. However, other cases, the function that the calling function requires is in a helper class, and the component, that's the Joomla component, has to call some other function within our extension in order to get the class of the helper file which has the function that it really requires. So for example, our router, it will call create router to find the router class, which it can then call build on. We're going to look in particular at com associations to find out how it works. Remember, it is wanting to get the item types. So what we have in our code here is we have an associations helper file, and this is basically similar to the Joomla 3 equivalent. We have in there a variable called item types, which we've set to an array of 2 elements, hello world and category, and these are the 2 types of elements that can have associations. And then we extend association extension helper, and if we look at that, it's Joomla CMS association extension helper. So if we look at that on the file system, it's in the library source association extension helper. And if we open that and we go down and we see get item types is a function there which just returns the item types that we've set up here. So in that way, com associations is getting from the helper file, it's got access to this get item types function, which then returns the item types that it needs. The only question is, how does this get associations extension get to return that class? So if we look a little more at our Hello World component, and unfortunately this is where it gets a bit convoluted, so it is, you just have to follow it through and persevere with it. But what we have here is a category service trait, and that's not the one we want. It's the association service trait that is the one we want. And the association service trait, we'll look at it. It's in Joomla CMS association service trait. So it's in that same directory. And there it is, association service trait. And sure enough, when we look at it, remember this is the function we want. We have this get associations extension, and it's going to return the associations extension, which gets set in set associations extension. Notice there's a wee bit of difference there. There's an S there, which there isn't in the set. Okay. So how does our class get set in this function here? Well, this is where we have to go back to our services provider.php. Now I'm just going to dip into this file in a little bit. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but there is going to be another video where I do go through it in detail and kind of explain all what's going on here. So if you persevere with me for that. But whenever we run this boot component will run this file here. And in this file, we've got a couple of things. We're setting up a new associations helper here. And that associations helper is within our administrator area, helper associations helper.php. So it's that file that we just looked at, source helper associations helper.php. And we create an instance of that here. Then when we come down here, we have this line here, component equals new hello world component. So we're creating an instance of our extension class. And then further on down here, we're calling on that component, that instance of our extension class, we're calling set association extension, and we get back this associations helper that we set up here. So we set it, instantiate it here, and then in this line here, we're actually setting it against our component using this set association extension, which is, you remember, in this trait. So our hello world component uses this trait. Now, if you're not familiar with traits, by the way, it's worth it looking at PHP manual. They're really a way that PHP uses to provide something like multiple inheritance without it being formal multiple inheritance. It enables us to reuse bits of code, and when we have a statement like this used within here, within the class, not one of these uses here, it will basically copy and paste this code which is in here into our class, but with one difference. Whenever we have a function in this trait, we can override it within our own class. So say we're using this trait, the association service trait, that gives us these functions, get associations, set associations. In our provider.php, we're creating our helper, and then in this line setting that association so that whenever the get association is called, it returns that helper class. And in that way, the com associations, when it calls get associations extension, it will get back the helper class, and that helper class will have this get item types function available to it to provide the information that com associations needs. As I say, it's all a bit convoluted, but you just have to bear with it. Some functions are available via inheritance or traits, and we've just looked at an example of where the function is available via a trait in this com associations one. Another example, router service trait, we're going to look at whenever we look at the Joomla4 router, so I'm not going to look at that now. The one I'm going to look at is category service trait, and one of the changes to the UI within Joomla4 is that if you look at, say, com content categories, you see this thing here, these totals here, and really what this is saying is these are the various status values. So if I hover over there, you can see published items, and the other ones are unpublished items and archived and deleted or trashed items. And really what this is doing is for each of the categories here, it is counting up the number of articles which there are with these various status values. And this is com categories, which is running here. So in order to get this information, these counts, it will be calling into our extension, and it will be wanting to call a function called count items. So let's have a look and see how that's implemented. if we go back to our extension, we have this category service trait. And category service trait, we'll look and see it's in Joomla CMS categories, category service trait. So we find that on disk, and it's in categories, category service trait. And we look down at it, we see here it is, count items. And if you imagine what this count items function needs to do, basically it needs to count up the number of articles in each of these categories. So it's really doing a SQL statement on the database table, counting up the number of items with each of these status characteristics, the published items, and splitting them up by categories. So if you imagine what that SQL statement might look like, in order to create that SQL statement, this functionality needs to know two things, and then it can provide a generic kind of SQL statement that will work for any component. It needs to know the table name. In our case, it's going to be Hello World, and it needs to know the column which is used to hold the status values or to hold the published status values. And knowing that those two things, it can create a SQL statement that will return those values. So if we look at these two functions here, get table name for section, we've got it down here. And obviously this is just a trait, it doesn't know what our table name is, so it's just returning null. And similarly, get state column for section is just returning null. But in including this category service trait, as I mentioned, we can override those functions. So if we provide our own functions there, get table name for section and get state column for section, then it will take those values in preference to what is in the trait, and it will use these functions instead of the functions in the trait. We override those, and we're basically returning Hello World because Hello World is the name of our database table, and published is the name of the database table field that holds the published status. So in that way, that's all that we have to do, and the category service trait will then have, this one will then have the functionality down here to perform the SQL statement that COM categories needs. And if we go to our component, Hello World and categories, and that's basically it, working okay as expected. So we've done the category service trait. I'm going to come back to this in a few moments, so I'm just going to leave that for now. But one thing that is quite important is you do have to declare explicitly that the extension meets the appropriate interface. So whenever we look at our Hello World component, you'll see a list of interfaces that are supported by this component. As you're probably aware, all of these things like interfaces and traits are namespaced and everything. So if we look at categories, category service interface, and we see these are the functions which have to be provided in that interface. In particular, there's the count items one that we used to create those counts. And the reason for that is whenever boot component instantiates our extension interface and returns the component back to these kind of calling functions, quite often what happens is this calling function goes ahead and asks if component instance, which has just been returned from boot component, if the component instance is instance of the various interfaces, then it will go and try and access the function. So if you're finding that you've got an extension class set up and the function that you expect to be getting called isn't getting called, just make sure you've got this interface implements statement against that hello world component. The final things on this slide is com tags call is not changed. So the observant among you will have seen that com tags here uses this mechanism here, and I've left it out here. And the reason is that com tags isn't changed. I suspect that the reason is that whenever you call boot component to set up all of this extension stuff, it really does take a lot of work, a lot of resources. So if you're calling that repeatedly whenever you're outputting all of these items, and there could be stacks of these, it's going to take a long time to return. I suppose com tags could cache locally. It could call it once and then get the helper class name once and then use that in subsequent items of the same type, but it doesn't, and it just continues with the existing functionality as it stands. This means that whenever we have our helpers, our site functionality, we need to set up this hello world helper root and put in get hello world root, get a category root in the way that we did for Joomla version 3. Okay, let's go back to this, and this is associated with this get dispatcher call. Now in Joomla 3, whenever it wanted to run our component, it basically did a require of hello world.php on our site or administrator instance. In Joomla 4 that's changed, and in Joomla 4 when it wants to run the component, it calls on our extension a get dispatcher to get a class known as the dispatcher, and then it calls dispatch to actually run our component. So let's see how that works. And in this case, what we have is we have our hello world component extends MVC component. So we're going to have a look at that. It extends Joomla CMS extension MVC component. So this is this file. We see that this class in turn extends component, and there's no use statement for this component here, so it means it's in the same namespace here, so it should be in the same folder, and indeed it is. There's component, and here the component is what has our get dispatcher class. So we've got one item of the puzzle here. We've got this get dispatcher class, which we find in the component instance that we've inherited from. And let's look at the code for this. This returns dispatcher factory, create dispatcher. Now where does that come from? Well, we've looked at this dispatcher factory. We can see that that is set in the constructor. So whenever we construct this component, and whenever we construct basically the hello world component, we're going to be passing in basically a dispatcher factory, and we store that, and then we retrieve it whenever get dispatcher gets called. We retrieve it and then create dispatcher on it. So let's look first of all at how this dispatcher factory gets kind of injected into our constructor. And to do that, we need to go back to our servicesprovider.php file. And we look here, and we have got a new component dispatcher factory. So this is the factory class that we were talking about. And down here we get component equals new hello world component, and we're going to pass that dispatcher factory in. Now again, I'm glossing over things here which will become clearer later, but if you just trust me on this for now, that dispatcher factory will then get put into this hello world component into the constructor, and that's how we get it whenever we have this component here. Let's look at the dispatcher factory then. It's going to be in Joomla CMS dispatcher. That's the one that we want. Component dispatcher factory. And there's our create dispatcher. Remember, whenever we were looking at this, we wanted to get the dispatcher factory and then call create dispatcher on it. So here's our create dispatcher. And what it's doing here is it's forming a class name. Right, so it's forming a class name using our namespace, using the name. The name is the application get name, so that will be either site or administrator. And then it's adding on dispatcher. So we could have in our namespace, we could have, if this was an administrator, for example, we could have source dispatcher, but we haven't got one because if we don't have one, it kind of defaults to something that we use anyway. But if you want to see an example of one, I think there is one in COM menus, if my memory serves me right. No, perhaps not. Maybe in the there it is actually. Yes. So in the site COM menu source, there's a dispatcher, and you can have a look at that if you like. But if we don't have our own dispatcher class, then it drops back to saying have a component dispatcher. This component dispatcher : class is just a shorthand way of providing the fully qualified name of this component dispatcher. And the component dispatcher, there's no use statement, so it's basically Joomla CMS dispatcher / component dispatcher. So that is just a string representing that class name. And if we look at that, we have to go to dispatcher, component dispatcher. So this is the file that we will use, and we go down here, and this is our dispatch. And that's what I'm going to be looking at in the next video. But just before we close this one, let's just have a look back at our Hello World component, just to make sure we've covered everything. So if we look down through the code here, we've got this boot call, and we're going to look at that in a bit more detail whenever we look at HTML snippets. We've covered get table name and get state column for section. In our categories, providing that count items function. We're going to look at routing separately, and we've done the get context and validate section, which is used by COM fields. Category service trait is the means by which we get that count items function. Router service trait we're going to have a look at whenever we look at the router. HTML registry aware trait we're going to look at whenever we use this boot thing for HTML snippets. Association service trait we've looked at in conjunction with associations, and database aware trait really just enables us to get the database whenever you do factory get DBO, and just enables us to get that database instance in a bit more nicer and faster way. So we've covered basically what is in that Hello World component, and in the next video I'm going to look a bit more in the dispatcher. So thanks for listening, and hope hopefully you find it useful. Bye.